Cool. All right, Nick, it's good to have you back. This is part four, I believe, of book review of Why I'm Not a Buddhist by Evan Thompson. Nick, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thanks for having me back.
Awesome. Yeah, of course. I'm having a lot of fun going through this book with you. Um, let's just jump right into it. What were your so chapter four, if you're reading along, is called Mindfulness Mania. And to summarize briefly, it's kind of a polemic against Buddhist modernist conceptions of mindfulness and mindfulness practice. Um, and I really like this chapter. I do have some pretty strong criticisms, but overall, um, I I really liked it the first time I read it, and I liked it even more the second time I read it. But how about you? What are your first impressions of this chapter?
I feel very much the same. People who have been listening along and watching along and reading along with us will know that chapter three was a really sticky chapter for me. I had a lot of problems with parts of the argument and the way that he made it. But here, I actually agree with quite a lot of it. And your critiques, as we'll get into, are quite founded. But overall, I still agree with his stance and I agree with a lot of the ways that he's made his stance clear. And I can't wait to talk about it and to sort of unpack what he means by mindfulness mania.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I like the title. It's
It's really good. Yeah.
yeah, kind of grabs your attention. So, I had sent you a few talking points, and I'll just go ahead and read off some of those. So, um, the first thing I wanted to get to is Thompson's assessment of McMindfulness or McMindfulness. And basically, it's this notion of mindfulness being very corporatized, very commercialized, kind of, putting a nice ribbon on it and making it into a service that can be marketed and sold for profit. And he doesn't disagree with this point, and he says it's good as far as it goes. But he essentially makes the argument that this is kind of a superficial, this is almost the most superficial way to look at it. And then he goes on and says that, well, this is not just true specifically of mindfulness, but kind of Asian religions in general, and that this goes back to the 60s and the 70s when there was this, very pronounced interest in Asian religion and culture in America and Europe. Um, so uh, so I guess let's start with the first thing about money. So um, I'll go ahead and read what I sent you if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, okay. What I find most interesting in these first few pages here is Thompson's argument against money as diluting spiritual merit, on the basis that the historical evolution of Buddhism and its spreading across Asia necessarily involves an interplay with wealthy merchants, trade routes, and necessarily involves the idea of spiritual merit in exchange for financial support of the Sangha. Um, that's kind of the main point. I don't have to read all the rest of it. Um, but yeah, I guess kind of based on what I sent you there, um, what do you see as being and I agree with him. In other words, I don't think that I think it's a very deep and profound way to look at it, because essentially what he's saying is, well, if we're going to critique mindfulness for like being diluted because it's, has money involved with it, um, we have to critique all of Buddhism essentially, because that's how it develops. Um, and I would say that's probably the right way to develop. The other way is what the Abrahamic monotheistic religions did, of crusades and wars, and Buddhism is generally very peaceful in its development over time. And I think a large reason for that is that um, so much of its development can be attributed to um, being carried through trade and the merchant classes and so on. Um, so what's your take on all this? I think it's a good point to make, and I'm curious to know what you see as the relationship between wealth and money and spiritual merit in general, and then specifically with Buddhism.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'll start with this idea of McMindfulness and the critiques against it.
Mhm.
First, yes, um, I think that a lot of the mindfulness stuff out there is for the purpose of buying and selling and for profit making, right? There's a lot of meditation apps. There's a lot of people who make money on guided meditations on television and YouTube and all this other stuff on Spotify. And there's plenty of this sort of whitewashed, emptied out sort of pseudo self-help, meaningless nonsense that um, people are kind of engaging in because they think that, oh, it makes me more centered, it makes me more grounded, it makes me more this. Or I've always had an interest in Buddhism. I've always been interested in the Far East and stuff like that. And it's a craze. And that's why he calls it mindfulness mania. It's a craze that has taken over since the 60s and 70s, like you said. And that's due in part to the work of profiteering individuals, but it's also due to Buddhists themselves. It's due to D.T. Suzuki. It's due to other people that we've discussed on this show who have sort of brought East Asian Buddhism to the US in a way that's different than the way that East Asian migrants working on railroads brought it.
Mhm.
Those communities brought it by basically continuing to do what they did at home, and they just continue to do it over here in their communities, and their communities are insulated, right, because they're being sort of extracted for profit. But then later on, DT Suzuki and others come around and they present Buddhism as a completed, singular, coherent, cohesive thing, similar to how Christianity is presented. And they had a vested interest in basically giving Buddhism, Buddhists, and by extension, East Asians, a seat at the table where Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were already eating.
Mhm.
And we can talk about that in a later episode, but that's essentially the story here. And that's sort of how this all starts. I think this idea of critiquing mindfulness on its grounds of being, you know, a very capitalist and a very profit driven endeavor, and his saying that that's kind of what all of Buddhism has been for all of its history, I think that he's right to say all of that. Because first, if you look to the earliest of early Buddhism, the Sangha had to take food, alms, and other donations from the community in order to survive. They had to go and beg because they were prohibited from owning anything. You couldn't farm, you couldn't have a house, you couldn't have more than one set of clothes, you couldn't have more than one bowl, you couldn't keep seeds, you couldn't store food. You had to exist solely on the generosity of the community, the lay people around you. And there
Sure.
was an exchange going on there. If I donate to you, the monk, then I get some benefit spiritually for having donated, and you get the benefit of eating. You get the benefit of material goods. And this continues on and on and on. Once Buddhism gets to China, then this sort of, supporting beggars on the street as Buddhist disciples, that sort of stops, and monasteries become a lot more centralized and lay people donate to them in a much more centralized way. But then, of course, the idea of sort of performing ritual services for larger groups of people all at one time sort of takes place. And
Mm.
there's a development of a tradition that is still an exchange between the monastics and the lay people. And I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole trajectory, but you go all the way to even the present day, where you can go to Buddhist temples in Japan and pay 300 yen, or $2.50 American dollars, and get a little omamori, one of which I have on my microphone here. I'll show it. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but
Yep.
I did this at my local Shingon temple, and it's just a little cheap image of the Buddha of this year in the zodiac cycle. So this is Fugen
Okay.
Bosatsu or Samantabhadra, and as a sort of way of supporting the temple, you can give them this money, and they'll give you this omamori, and they'll make a profit in the end. Um, because this
Awesome.
is cheaper and it's a way to donate essentially and then have some sort of receipt of your donation. And this omamori is supposed to give, some sort of protective spiritual benefit. It's supposed to
Yeah.
protect against misfortune or whatever. You're buying wellness, you're buying luck, you're buying, you know, protection from anything bad. And so, yes, it is deeply, deeply connected to finances and economic systems. And he
Mhm.
says, mindfulness mania is no different. For more on this, I deeply encourage listeners to read a book I read that presents a novel theory of religion in the modern era, in the current times, called Consuming Religion by Catherine Lofton. She presents the current environment, the current ecosystem of religion in modern times in the West as being like going to the store and having brands of shampoos to choose from. Basically, it's a pre-selected sort of variance in the branding and in the packaging of spirituality, but ultimately it is going to take the exact same place in your life, whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, atheism. And it's also going to sort of benefit somebody somehow, right?
Mhm.
And her sort of central example that she brings up in the introduction for this is that there's now a hotel chain in the American Midwest where instead of having a Gideon Bible, like most hotels have had for years now, in the hotel room, they have a room service sheet. And on that room service sheet is the Lotus Sutra, the Tao Te Ching, the Quran, the Talmud, and the Bible, and a couple other. And I think even Darwin's Origin of Species is on there, right? It's
Hmm.
like
Interesting.
it's a pre-selected menu, and it's decided these are the religions, and the Tao Te Ching is the Bible of Taoism, and the Lotus Sutra is the Bible of Buddhism, and it's all very Christian centric and very westernized and very streamlined in a capitalist and consumptive way.
Hmm.
Highly recommend that because that's exactly what's going on with this McMindfulness situation.
Gotcha.
And then one final point I wanted to mention too is that um, if you want a if you want to understand how Buddhism travels, you have to understand economic systems. Buddhism traveled from India to China on the Silk Route, and what were they doing on that route? They were buying and selling silk, and
Right.
so they came for the transaction, money for silk or, you know, item for item, and they stayed for the cultural exchange. I have I've met this guy and he is chanting a mantra. What does that mean? What is that? I've met this guy and he's got an icon of the Buddha on his wagon. Who is that? What is that? Why are they doing that? And
Sure.
so this sort of exchange happens in these borderlands and in these trading regions. And so that's key. Buddhism travels along economic routes throughout history. It travels as a means of these sort of trade relationships. It's a missionary religion, as Thompson correctly points out.
Mhm.
And the very act of missionary activity that religions do makes
Mhm.
use of or even exists only due to the graces of trade relationships. Missionaries don't go places where there's not a transaction going on. And so this is sort of the core of how Buddhism moves and how Buddhists go from place to place and take with them Buddhism. So I think that that's he's drawn this very correctly and he's drawn this in a very interesting way. And I don't have any critique here because he's spot on.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. That was a great overview. I did have some more that I had kind of sent along with that note.
Yeah.
I would, yeah. Well, what do you think? I wouldn't mind holding off on it, honestly, because I really want to read that book now that you recommended. Um, and kind of looking at it like just as religion in general. I'd said some things about Jordan Peterson and Joel Osteen as kind of being religious charlatans, and I'm not really backing down on that. But I think that it could even apply to not just the big religions of of world religion, but I'm thinking now even of like shamanism. Shamanism is very, I mean, well, we can talk about shamanism later on. There's many shamanisms. There's no one shamanism, and that's, a very Eurocentric conception, which is fine. But yeah, I mean, there are plenty of you know, shamanic charlatans who are happy and eager to take your money and have you spend thousands of dollars on this ayahuasca ceremony that maybe they just invented like the day before from like a YouTube video or something. Who knows? And I'm not saying that's everyone, but I'm just saying that I think it's a very um there's a lot to it. Would you want to save that until later
I
on, or
think
do
it's
you
I
want
think that you've brought up the issue very nicely, and I think it would be good to cap our discussion of economics and religion with it. And so, as I understand it from what you've sent me, your question is, how do we separate the Buddha from these greedy charlatans like Jordan Peterson and Joel Osteen and
yeah.
many other, examples in the current times, but also across history? Is that sort of,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That yeah, no, that was a good summary of it.
So I'm interested to hear what you think about this after I give my answer, but I think that it is all entirely subjective how you decide those things, because whether we like it or not, it's the world we live in that religion is an economic thing. That's kind of where I agree with Marxism quite well, is not to go so far as to say that it's the opiate of the masses to allow them to continue to be extorted, for profit. But I do agree that it is an economic thing. It relies on economic relationships. It relies on trade relationships. There are all kinds of exchange going on in religion, and sometimes they're financial and economic, and sometimes they're also not. They're spiritual. I'll give you this ritual in exchange for this blessing or something like that, whatever. And it's subjective how you decide, is this a greedy structure, a greedy system, or is this something genuine? And when you're judging figures, it's subjective. Is this person greedy? Is this person for profit? Is this a charlatan? Or is this someone who's genuine? I think that there's a whole spectrum of religious figures for whom you could argue about this for eons, right? I tend to think that the Buddha stood to profit the least from his teaching, his own teaching. And so let's say, just for the sake of this argument, that he is on the end of the spectrum that is genuine, that is not profit motivated, that's not possession motivated, that's not status and title motivated. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, we can put guys like Joel Osteen and Jordan Peterson, who are in it for clicks and for money. And in the middle is everybody else. There's Jesus, Muhammad, Confucius. I mean, all these founding figures in all these religions. There's all the saints in Catholicism. You have to ask yourself, like, are they in this for money or not? And yeah, I mean, there's evidence, like Joel Osteen's big giant mega house, right? Like that's evidence. Like, okay, something's going on here. Like God didn't do that. People did that. You know what I mean? God
Yeah.
didn't give him this kingdom. He took that kingdom from somebody else. Um,
Mhm.
and then there's no mega house for the Buddha in the past. There's no mega house for Confucius in the past, but maybe he stood to benefit from creating a society that worked the way that he said that it did. So it's something that you have to make your own judgment about. And you just have to train yourself to think critically and to think in a way that looks out for you and looks out for the most people all the time, in order to see, like, hey, this isn't working out because people give David Miscavige, the Scientology guy, all of their money and all of their agency and all of their sort basically total ownership over their entire humanity. And what are they getting in return? Nothing. They're getting rape. They're getting extortion. They're getting beatings. They're getting thought control. They're getting labor camps, right? In exchange for giving all of this to David Miscavige. So critically thinking, you're like, okay, yeah, I can see obviously that's not benefiting. What are people getting in exchange whenever they become disciples of the Buddha in history? Well, they're not getting big giant mansions. They're not getting a whole bunch of money. We're not finding them, buried in these temples with a dragon's hoard of gold. And so you can say to yourself, I'm pretty certain that, what I'm looking at is not extortionate.
Yeah. No, thank you. Those were some very good examples. I think I agree 100% with your analysis. As you were saying all that, I was kind of thinking, there are many atheists who would just see all of religion as charlatanism and just this kind of, you know, this game for profit. Um, but I can't agree with that at all. Even religions that I don't necessarily buy into that much, like Christianity or Islam or they're like when I look at Christian monastics, I'm like, okay, they're they've literally sworn to a life of poverty, and I'm not saying that you have to go to that extreme to be authentic, um,
But
right?
you can
But
see that they pretty much are, you know.
yeah, yeah, they're walking their talk, and I think I very much agree with that assessment. Um, yeah, the only thing that I would add, and I don't even necessarily disagree, is that I would also add in addition to the critical thinking piece is this like felt subjective piece. And I think you mentioned that this like
Hmm.
subjectiveness of like how does the vibe check out? Does it feel like you're being initiated into a cult? Does it feel like you're being taken advantage of? Does it feel like you have the power to do that? And people will lay out very good arguments of why you should sell your soul and why you should, you know, um, I don't know, get you to do things that just aren't, that cross your boundaries. And you have the right to say, you know what, that's bullshit. I'm not gonna
Hmm.
do that. I'm not gonna participate in this. See ya. Bye. Um, and maybe you're wrong. Maybe the person was genuinely, you know, spiritual or whatever you'd like to call it. Um, it's an adventure, I think. I don't want to sound like, I don't know, like make it like more mystical than it has to be, but I really do think like this whole enterprise is like very much a journey, whether you choose one religion or none of them.
Well, and that's something that I've mentioned too. You brought up this issue of the asking yourself, is this something that feels right for me? Is this something that crosses my boundaries? It's important to do some introspection and do some um, sort of garden tending, so to speak, to make sure that you do have boundaries and that you do respect yourself and take care of yourself in any of these settings or none of these settings, because that's kind of one of the more evil things that cults do. Their whole recruitment style relies on preying on people who have low self-confidence, who have low feelings of belonging, who have low opinions of themselves and of their station in the world. And the cults offer high, you know, high levels of community, high levels of feelings of belonging, high levels of station in the world,
Right.
and spiritual peace in the future. And so it's important that you sort of do what you can to prevent that. It's nobody's fault that they get preyed upon in that way. It's very unfortunate that it happens, but it's not the person who is the prey their fault. It's the predator's fault. I did an episode um, a while ago now on Buddhist cults. They're out there and they do exist. But one of the things is that we discussed is like, what is the line between a cult of personality around somebody who's like, I'm the reincarnation of Jesus and Buddha and Thor and Loki and Superman all in one person, and a cult by the religious studies definition of the word, which is just a group of worshipers around one figure in an existing religion. And
Yeah.
then the line between those things and also just religion at large. Many of these major religions are worship around a single group of deities, and you all do common practices and common things around that person or group of people. So it's like the answer, where is that line, is something you mentioned. It's a subjective feeling. You know it when you see it. Like I learned 11 theories of religion in my grad school theory classes about religious studies. And the conclusion that I came to after learning about all of those 11 different theories of religion is truly, you'll just know it when you see it. There is no prescriptive theory of religion. There can't be. There is only descriptive theories of religion. There's only theories that show you this isn't a dimension of religion. This is something that helps you know you might be looking at a religion. But at the end of the day, you just have to ask yourself, you know, is this a religion or not? You have to
Yeah.
know it when you see it. It's a subjective thing. And so, yeah, I agree. It's a journey and it's very interesting.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's super interesting. That'd be a really cool episode too, because I'm thinking like, early Christianity, like literally, after Jesus either died or went to heaven or whichever you believe, um, that would have like if you saw Christianity in that state, like a bunch of people practicing in caves and doing sacraments and like you'd be like, holy shit, this is a cult. Um,
Mhm.
but now it's, you know, I don't know what percentage of the population, but it's quite normal. Um, and there's a lot of differences between now and then. I'm just saying, like, you know, a lot of people practice it, um, and so
It's
anyway,
it's evolved from this cult of personality to now the biggest religion on earth, and it's like,
yeah,
at what stage did it stop being a cult of personality and did it turn into what we would say is definitively a religion?
yeah, that is a really cool thing to consider. Um, I'd love to do a future episode on that. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, awesome. Thank you for like articulating all that and giving us all of that to think about. Um, okay, so I guess I'll get into some of my critiques of Thompson here. So he has a lot of good criticisms about um Buddhist modernist conceptions of mindfulness. And I have a quote that I'll just read that pretty much encapsulates this whole um chapter. But the first thing I'd like to do is critique him on um essentially he introduces like the notion of positive mental health benefits of mindfulness meditation practice. And I feel like he's really uncritical, and I feel like he's just not looking at the evidence here. Now, um, at this point, I can tell he's a pretty deep thinker, regardless of whether you agree or disagree on, the merits of, one particular or whatever particular issue. He's a very big deep thinker. So I know that he's not just ignoring the evidence here, but um so what I wrote is this. Thompson argues that anything changes your brain, and he's arguing against people who say um like mindfulness meditation literally changes your brain. And he's saying anything can change your brain. And I agree with that actually. Exercise changes your brain. Eating healthy and there's so many different behaviors, and so many different factors that play into um the development of the brain, and the structure of the brain, and the activity of the brain. Um, but I don't think that, therefore you can just dismiss all of the evidence in support of um, mindfulness meditation practice as being truly beneficial to people's mental health. There is meta-analysis after meta-analysis after meta-analysis of, like all the cascades of mental health benefits that it can bring. Um, I think that a good point he could have said was, well, maybe this data is not as robust as it seems. Maybe this data is not as um, strong as it appears to be. And I could sympathize um, with that point of view. I wrote that, um, if we're going to talk about the quality of the data itself, like positivity biases, and he mentions this, um, people might be prone to saying like, "Oh, mindfulness really helped me. I do feel better. I do feel less depressed." And there's an obvious bias there where, people who feel depressed probably would like to feel better and might unconsciously perceive themselves as feeling happier than they actually do to either, alleviate their symptoms or because they want to look good for the study. There's a number of different biases. Um, but I don't think those are just limited to mindfulness. That's a problem across all of psychology. Um, and he doesn't really take it to that step. He kind of just wages those charges against mindfulness, and I don't think that's warranted to only say those are problems of mindfulness meditation, because then whatever other practices, he's going to say, well, these change your brain too. Well, those are subject to the same biases in study and in experimentation as the mindfulness one. So um, that's kind of the long and the short of it. I think he could have been more fair um, in his analysis there. I think he really just writes off like, it feels, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but it feels like he's just saying like, no, actually it doesn't really do much at all. Um, but I don't I don't I just don't think he's giving enough credit where credit is due, even though I do very much agree with the Buddhist modernist kind of argument that he's making, um, or arguing against the Buddhist modernist conception of mindfulness. What do you think of all that? I know I said a lot, but
No, thanks for giving your side of that. I'm glad that you brought that in because that's something that I missed because I don't read that stuff and I don't live in that world. So it's good that you mentioned that. I think that positivity bias, it's so layered, right? Because there's the bias of the people doing the research. They live in this world where all they see is mindfulness is so good for you, and they seek to test out that hypothesis, that claim, and they are only surrounded by mindfulness is good for you. And so they might have an unconscious bias that makes them assess the data that comes back in a positive light, or they might have a conscious bias where they work for, I don't know, they work for a research institution that stands to profit if mindfulness is a good thing, or they work for a person who's got that benefit. But then you also mentioned there's also the bias of the people who go into it. They go into these research studies and they're like, I want to feel better and I'm going to do things that make me feel better. And they also, again, are in that world where all they see is mindfulness is good for you. So they've already sort of made up their mind that mindfulness is going to make their symptoms better, whatever they are. And whenever they've decided that, then the data is unusable. And so there's a huge issue of the quality of data for mindfulness, but also exercise and also good dieting and also all this other stuff because it's you can't actually put a person in a vacuum in order to get good data out of them. And as
Yes.
much as we want to, it's impossible. And so,
Right.
like you say, if you want to speak to that, go for it. But he doesn't speak to that. He just says that all of it is, bad and meaningless. If I had to stand in his shoes and give a response as to why he presents it in that way, why he's sort of uncritical here, I think it's because he doesn't want to waste his time. He
Mm,
views all of this body of research as categorically and ontologically misguided. He views all of this research probably because he hasn't read it all, or probably because he's read some bad examples, or probably because he's a cognitive scientist and he has his own sort of biases and agendas. But he
mm.
views all of this as sort of incorrectly
Okay.
examining the brain as the center of where mindfulness happens and where the benefit happens. You know what I mean? He goes into this later in the chapter. He thinks it's wrong to think that the mind is in the brain and that mindfulness happens and can be studied and can be sort of apprehended in the brain. And he thinks that it's incorrect to study the benefits therein, not looking at the whole embodied person. And he thinks that a
Okay.
much better way of examining this would be to look at a whole person. I still think, though, that he's wrong about that, because what about those studies that say that mindfulness makes your blood pressure go down? That's not a brain thing. You're not doing an fMRI to see that somebody's blood pressure has gone down. So I'm more on your side, but I wanted to sort of step into his brain and see if I could say what I think that he would say if he was on the show. See if I could say what I think, the reason that I think he would give for why he sort of writes a lot of it off in a very broad stroke, because he views it, as he later states, as beginning and ending in a wrong assumption, in a wrong place.
Okay. No, I actually think that you are spot on with that assessment. Um, and yeah, as soon as you said that, I feel like I very much agree. Um, Maybe it's not so much he just sees it as like, oh, this is useless. This has like literally no merit whatsoever, but that this way of conceiving of the mind is fundamentally misguided in many
Mhm.
ways. So why should I spend that much time on it? Um, I can see that actually, and that makes a lot more sense.
But I
Uh,
still think that you're right because of the amount of data out there, tainted though it is, by all the biases we've talked about, that says it makes your blood pressure go down. It makes your cortisol levels go down. It makes, basically it does all of these bodily functions for you.
mhm,
Whether we like it or not, that those studies are out there, and that is not an examination of like the mind in brain in head sort of approach. But he doesn't look at that either. I think he should look at that stuff. And
right.
if he wants to critique its quality, then fine, but don't say that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Because that would actually, and I guess what you're like referring to is like all of, yeah, like you said, like the physiological benefits, like lowered heart rate. I think
Hmm.
like lowered uh blood pressure, or um just all the myriad of like physical health benefits that mindfulness has. Um that would lend itself to the embodied model
Yes.
that he proposes of like, essentially consciousness is in the body.
Yes.
And that would lend itself to, well, here's a um an example in which the body, if to take a dualist perspective, for just a moment, is literally affected by um mindfulness meditation directly. And
Mm.
that research, I'd say, is a lot less prone to error than is you know measures of subjective depression or anxiety. It's That's kind of just the hard data, is is what's your blood pressure, what's your heart rate, um so on and so forth. Um so so let's get into that then, because this is getting really interesting. So I'm going to read the quote that I I read it. It's like about like halfway through the chapter, And then I read it and I was like, okay, well, I don't need to read the rest of the chapter now because I pretty much get the whole argument that he's going to make here. And I agree with most of it. Um, but there's some places where I disagree. So he's talking about this neurocentric conception of the mind, and I'll let him articulate it. So he says, I give two arguments against this way of thinking, against thinking that consciousness is in the brain and that we can reduce it to brain activity, brain activity between brain structures, etc. I give two arguments against this way of thinking about meditation and the brain. The first argument shows that it's empirically unwarranted to map the cognitive functions involved in meditation practice in general and mindfulness meditation in particular onto particular brain areas or networks. The second argument shows that it's a conceptual mistake to superimpose mindfulness onto particular brain areas or networks. Um, I I completely agree with both of those. Um, there might be some nuanced places where that I'm not thinking of where I would disagree. But I want to run it by you. What do you think in general?
I agree completely. I think that in the West, we have this huge bias towards thinking that mind and consciousness and psychology happens in the brain and not really anywhere else. But he makes a strong case, and there is a strong case out there in general that that's just not true, that it is embodied, like he says, the embodied mind that he comes up, that he presents.
Hmm.
And um, and there's other types of biases in other places too. Like whenever people in Japan, for example, culturally speaking, um, before westernization and before Western science became sort of the top standard for knowledge production and for the understanding of self that we have, they used to think that all thoughts and feelings and emotions and um, desires and such all happened in the chest, right here in the heart. And it's and there's examples all across history of people thinking, oh, it all happens right here, and not, but it's such an incomplete picture. It's kind of impossible to assign all of that to one organ. And you have to give them credit. It's hard whenever you don't have the benefit of like modern technology to understand that feelings and emotions and thoughts and cognitive activities, cognitions, they take place on the whole body all at one time. It's so hard to see that without the technology we have now. But
Hmm.
he makes a really good case, and I agree with him strongly. And I think that if that really catches on, it could really shake up psychology and neuroscience in a big way. And it could lead to and encourage a great deal more interdisciplinarity, which is very much needed. And it could lead to a great deal more quality research and productive research that examines, you know, how do we medicate the person and not the brain, where we think that there's some sort of chemical imbalance. They always say chemical imbalance, when talking about mental illnesses. And it's like, how do you medicate the person rather than assigning this whole entire person's, first person consciousness experience to the numbers of dopamine molecules that you think are in their brain right now. Not that because it's very expensive and difficult to test that. You can't, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. You can't like
Hmm.
in a regular psychiatrist session. There are cases where you can do it, but in
Yeah.
the vast majority of people who show up there to get their Prozac and to get their Lexapro, you can't, and they don't actually like examine, and it's not useful to, because it's like, okay, well, you have enough dopamine, but is it being uptaken by your neurons at the correct rate at the correct times? Is
Yeah.
it being produced? Is it being uptaken too much? Does all these factors? And it's like you're getting too lost in the weeds. You need to sort of medicate the person, and you have to medicate an entire first person experience that they're having. in order to make real progress on a mental illness and not assign their whole life to that series of chemical reactions.
Yeah. And I would take it a step further and to draw on his own on the 4E cognitive science model and say that it's ecological as
Yes.
well. Um, there's a really good quote by this social worker, I forget her name, but she's a macro social worker, and she was talking about mental illness, and she said something like, it's not always the individual that needs to change. Sometimes it's the environment that needs to change.
Hmm.
um to only say like, yeah, it's, your dopamine levels are like not right, we're going to give you this and then that'll like boop it back up and blah blah blah. It's like, well, that's kind of ignoring the very violent neighborhood that they might live in that is causing legitimate anxiety, that might be ignoring the fact that they just lost their job, and you know not accounting for the very um understandable anxiety that they're experiencing, without taking stock of the environment. And I want to be clear here. Um, this might sound kind of cold, but I don't even think that insofar as we're talking about consciousness and the nature of consciousness, I don't even think it's necessarily important to consider that it might be invalidating, although it absolutely is important in a clinical setting when when you're doing mental health work and therapy. That's absolutely important. But um, if we're just looking at it objectively, I'd say that's not even really the most important piece. It's just inaccurate. It's
Hmm.
it's just not taking stock of the whole picture. Um,
Hmm.
and his 4E cognitive science model really does that. And it says that consciousness, um, I want to get your take on his bird analogy, actually, which I thought was really good. He says that um, we can kind of analogize the mind to flying. Like if a bird is flying, you wouldn't say that the flying is in the wings and that's the flying. It's an interaction between the wind, the bird's body, the wind patterns, and just everything, the environment. It literally doesn't make sense to take it in isolation, because if you only take it in isolation, there's no flight. Um, and I thought that was a very profound, but also a very simple and very profound um, analogy for me. What did you think about that?
I think so too. I think that understanding human beings as an ecological being and understanding consciousness as being ecological and environmental, I think that's very useful. And I think that it's difficult because like, yeah, then suddenly it complicates how we are able to treat people who have problems. We our system currently sort of has to be turned on its head. It has to be sort of reimagined and reframed in some vital way, and the whole system has to be renovated. But I think that it stands to benefit if it does, and I think that it's important that it does, and I think that um, it comes closer to being a more utilitarian system if we take this model and we sort of adopt it as the approach to treatment and to help and to support for people who have these issues. I think that it also will benefit many other fields if this sort of model is kind of adopted or accepted or looked at as a possible theory of understanding people, because you can also apply this to people in the past who are dead. And this is something that I think that history and anthropology really, really need to do. They're in the process of doing it, but they need to reimagine people in the distant past um, as being people who are complicated and who have first person consciousness and experience that is it's different from our own, but it works the same way in most cases. It is social. It is survivalist in the sense that they want to be able to eat and drink and have shelter. It is um, problem solving. They're presented with, X, Y, and Z problem, and they have A, B, and C resources to address that problem. And those problems and those resources may be different from our own, but there's a bias to look upon people in the past as stupider or as primitive or to question their decision making. I don't think that it's worthwhile to, I mean, of course, if we're looking at someone like Mao Zedong, right? And, you know, he says the birds are shitting on our crops and it's making the food bad. Let's kill all the birds, and then causes a famine that kills 60 million people. We can question his decision making, but we can't question the complexity of his first person consciousness. And we can't question that he had, X problem. The food is bad. It's being contaminated. And he had A, B, and C resources to solve it. He had an understanding that, oh, this is the cause of the problem, and I should address it this way. Yeah, we're critical that he killed so many people, but he's an example of somebody who had a complex first person consciousness. And we can go even further back. Forests have this mythological status in Japanese folklore and Japanese religion and Japanese culture. There's this idea that a wild, untamed forest is a land where the kami live, where deities live, where tricksters live, where all of these dangerous and unseen and animistic factors and elements live. And if you go in there, you have to be careful, you have to be respectful, you have to be this and that. And so, addressing forests, going through forests, establishing temples in forests, and so on, you have to address those spirits, those kami, those deities. And the reason why is because they are the forces of nature. They are the thing. They are the survival threat to you while you're in there. And so it's easy to be like materialist about things and be like, yeah, they're stupid. It's just trees and rocks and animals. If they had modern science, they wouldn't look at it that way. It's so easy to do stuff like that, but you can't think of it that way. You have to understand that they saw the forest as eating people because people would go in there and not come out. And then you couldn't find their remains when you went in to look for their remains. So they had, just like we have with modern science, to come up with an explanatory framework for why that was happening. And their gods are the kami and the spirits and the tricksters and the yokai and whatever. And our gods are predation and, ecology and whatnot. They're all the
Mm.
same. They're just different explanatory frameworks. And so we have to be kind to people in the past. We have to be kind to how they solve problems, and adopting this 4E approach and imposing it or applying it to people who exist to us only in text and in archaeology, I think is a very beneficial thing to do.
Awesome. Um, you said that all so much better than I could have. Um, but by the way, Nick, I'll have you know that Joan of Arc was actually a very troubled epileptic teenager who was subject to seizures and no, um, like the Neil deGrasse Tyson
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
assessment of history. Um, Smart guy, but yeah. No, I think that's it's actually a very poignant observation to make because it's like and I think as I'm reading his book, um like I see so many I think I wrote the word straw man in this chapter at least like 10 times in my annotations because he uses the phrase one to one mapping between particular behaviors and particular brain regions, and I'm like, dude, literally no one is saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then there are guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Michio Kaku who, although they see the world in a very, um, you know, profoundly intellectual way, um, are also, I would say, very philosophically lacking.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that I think he even mentions Neil deGrasse Tyson at some point. But I have to remind myself, like, that's who he's making these arguments against. That's the kind of um character that he's arguing against, because they do say these things, and because they do have such a weight in the cultural discourse of our times. Um
I wish that he would be specific in that regard because, like you say, it is a straw man issue. I don't know anybody who is a scientist who like says, yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson's right on. You know what I mean? I think that scientists also disavow him. And I think that they see him and Michio Kaku and many of these others as TV personalities first and scholars, if they're lucky, second. And
that's
they're
true.
entertainers, you know?
That's true, but I would say a lot of people
That's
look at
right.
and say, like, oh, like, no, this is like, you know, whatever the I fucking love science like Facebook newsfeed is, like, that's
Yeah.
like reality.
They think that
Or
he's representative of scientists in general. And I think that if I think Evan Thompson might want to be more specific and be like, I'm speaking to the imagination of, you know, the the mind in brain in head sort of way of looking at life, rather than saying that all scientists are saying this Neil deGrasse Tyson stuff and it's wrong. Because like they're not, you know?
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, that's very true. And I have to remind myself of that sometimes. It's like science, like, even from a scientific perspective, is not a monolith. Like, plenty of scientists who believe in God, believe in have their own religious lives,
Hmm.
um, that they leave or that they lead, excuse me, um, and so on. So yeah, we touched on a lot of the stuff that I had sent you actually. Um, just give me a minute here to kind of yeah. What did you think of the 4E cognition model? I think that it very much I the word that I would use to summarize this whole chapter is emergentist. It's very
Hmm.
much a polemic against reductionism, and I think that's good. Um, I think that there are uses for reductionism, and I hope I articulate that well in the Consilience article that I wrote. But um, it's not it's necessary but not sufficient in and of itself. Um, it's very emergentist, and then I think what the 4E cognitive science model offers is an appeal to phenomenology, but more than that, an appeal to this ecological view of consciousness as literally being an interaction between the person, uh, the mind, the body, and the environment. Um, so what did you think of the 4E model? I really liked it.
I really enjoyed it, and I think that I think it's well founded. I don't think it's complete in and of itself. I think that it could use some adoption and some workshopping and some expanding upon and some challenging and some critique in the academic community
Mhm.
because I think that that's how things sort of get perfected over time. Um, but I still think that it's a really, really good start. What I appreciate primarily is his diagnosis of the issue of Western medicine, Western science, Western cognitive science, and neuroscience oscillating between materialism and dualism. The
Yeah,
dualism of like, I am a mind, I have a body, but then the materialism of like, the brain is where the mind is, and it's the physical material of mind. And to study mind, you have to study brain, etc. I
mhm,
think that his critique of that is very strong, and I think that that diagnosis is well founded. Um,
yeah,
I remember I used to when I was a freshman in college, I had my very first intro philosophy class. This was my earliest class. It was the first college class that I set foot on campus and took. You know, I walked into that class as the very first thing I did in college after I had moved in and done all that. And in that class, you know, we explained sort of Cartesian idealism and Cartesian dualism and read about it and went through it and brought it out. And I was so convinced at the time. I was like, that makes so much sense. I was like, this is such a good argument. How could the guy that invented math be wrong? I was, I'm joking. I know he didn't invent math, but um, I was like, how could he be wrong about this? And incidentally, in that same year of college, I joined a martial arts club studying Ki Aikido, a Japanese martial art. And the singular thing at the core of it all, if I had to say there was any singular thing about it, the singular thing at the core of that entire tradition of martial arts is an out and out rejection of Cartesian dualism, mind and body. It is entirely, entirely about presenting and acting and proving the unity of mind and body. In fact, the full name for the martial art is Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. Shin, mind, other Shin, body, Toitsu, unifying, right? So it's Aikido, that unifies the mind and body, or is the unity of mind and body. And
Okay.
so like for a while I was uncritical. I was like, yeah, I'll do Aikido. Yeah, I understand, this mind body unification practice that I'm doing. But I'm still a Cartesian dualist. And then I had just like a breaking moment where I was like, oh my God, Descartes was wrong about so much stuff. He was so wrong. It just doesn't work at all. It doesn't hold up
There you
in
go.
any way. And incidentally, I'm sure that you can guess my Aikido got better. I got, I was better at doing it
Nice.
because I changed my mind. And
That's the enacted dimension
exactly.
of the
Yeah.
pouring model. There you go. Yeah.
And it works. It works. And I also speaking to materialism as well, mind is, inside brain. Um, or even saying mind is inside the physical organism's body. I think that those things are not really, I think that materialism at its core is not really provable or disprovable, just in the same way that its opposite is not really provable or disprovable. And
Mhm.
the reason why is because we have our senses and we have the objects of those senses. And so how are we going to make claims about the existence or the lack thereof of something that is non-material, right? We only
Yeah.
have access to matter. So we can't prove that and we can't prove its alternative. So I I sort of have always disavowed materialism as a perspective from which to understand anything in general as well, because like I say, it's just as unprovable, untestable, unfalsifiable as its alternative. And I think that I've also I think I'm influenced also because I've spent a lot of time with non-materialist ways of thinking. I'm sort of souped in Buddhism, which is non-materialist. And so that's kind of had an influence as well. But if you want to look at it scientifically, it doesn't hold up to the scientific method, nor does its opposite. So it's a matter of, you know, you have to decide or either be agnostic about it, be content in the not knowing, or decide that things are one way or the other.
Yeah. The more I look at consciousness from a number of different perspectives, the more I'm drawn to that last thing you said, kind of just like embrace the mystery. Because
Hmm.
you're gonna read something, you're gonna get sucked into it, you're gonna love it, and then you're gonna read something that completely fucking contradicts it and is actually pretty well argued. And
Hmm.
there's plenty of things that I don't believe. That I'm just like, no, I don't buy into that. But I think are still good ideas. But um, yeah, I think that's a very, I feel like that's the most mature um approach to have, and we all have our biases, we all have the things that we like and the things that we're drawn to, um, for one reason or another. But um, yeah, I think you gave a very, and I really like that example of Aikido. I um I kind of see like the same thing in mental health a little bit of like to take a very CBT oriented approach of like, you are not your thoughts, your thoughts are whatever they are, and you have these kind of distorted thoughts, and those are the things that are making you suffer. But then also this idea of like we like um mental health as being like wholeness, of being like oneness, of like um to draw on Jung, although there's not that many Jungians in mental health, I would say, anymore, of being individuated and like a
Mhm.
single unified, you know, mind essentially. Um, and there's modern versions of Jungian psychology actually that would be really interesting to talk about. But um, yeah, I thought that was a really good observation as well. Um,
In response to that, one of the things that I have become increasingly more okay with in my personal life, not in my academic and professional life, just because you'll see why. In my personal life, um, professionally and personally, I've always thought that contradiction has this connotation of like being a dirty word. Like you want to avoid contradiction. You want to avoid paradoxes. You want to avoid situations where both things, can't be true at the same time. And in my professional life as an academic, yeah, if there's contradictions in my book, it's not going to get published. If there's contradictions in my article, it's not going to get published. And that's going to jeopardize my job. But in a personal going through the day type of sense, I think that contradictions and paradoxes are actually fine and more or less the way actually to live, the way to get through the day. A contradiction, an example of a contradiction I'm talking about is like, I'm in control of my thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. If we believe in this extended cognition issue, that which I control, such as my environment, such as my appearance, such as, my social relationships, such as anything that I have control over, that this cognitive extension perspective would mean that is all a dimension of myself. And so if I'm in control of my thoughts, then that's a dimension of myself as well. Um, but that has the pitfall of like putting all the responsibility on me and saying to me essentially, oh, well, you're in control of your thoughts. So if you're having intrusive thoughts right now, that's your fault. You should stop that. Right? That doesn't work. And so while maintaining that truth, so to speak, I'm in control of my thoughts. I also maintain the truth. I am not my thoughts. They are not me. And that is a contradiction. That is a paradox. Those two things can't be true at the same time, but I
yeah,
don't care. I just simply don't care. And
yeah,
so, like, carrying contradictions and paradoxes from sizing from like a very small, inconsequential one all the way up to something big like that. It's how I get through the day. It's how I sort of, you know, it's like the Always Sunny in Philadelphia quote. I play both sides, so I always come out on top. Anytime it's convenient for me, I just take the opposite stance.
yeah,
Anytime it makes me feel better and makes my life better, I just take the opposite sort of perspective on myself or the opposite perspective on what's going on from the
yeah,
one that I held true or hold true at one time or the other. And for that reason, you can't trust anything I say or do at any time. But on the other hand, I think that that really helps. Accepting contradiction and holding contradiction within you and accepting paradox and holding paradox within you, that's a good thing to do.
yeah. I think so as well. I had my own kind of like epiphany a few years ago, and what I thought was that to live is to be a hypocrite. You will contradict your um core values, whatever those are. You will contradict whatever you think you believe at reality at some point in your life. And that doesn't even necessarily mean that you did the wrong thing. Um, like how did you say it? Like contradiction has like a bad kind of like a dirty connotation to it. I agree. It's not. I think that if there is enlightenment, it begins with realizing the internal contradictions that are built into existence, that are built into our existence as human beings. Um, you know, there are no rules. We're given ideas that other people came up with, but there's no like it's this or like it's that. It's like, yeah, it's a mystery. It is a mystery in the etymologically original sense, not in like a Sherlock Holmes like whodunit
Yeah.
type sense. It's like a living mystery, and yeah, you articulated that very well. So I
Thanks. And I'm glad that you brought up enlightenment as well, because, you know, Evan Thompson is telling us why he is not a Buddhist, and he's bringing up a lot of contradictions. And I think that some of the contradictions are there. I think some aren't there, but Buddhism itself does reflect on and does sit on and accept paradoxes and contradictions, right? For example, if we dig deeper into Mahayana style emptiness, we come into this doctrine of the two truths. And, one is provisional truth and one is absolute truth. And they're both truth. You can't have two types of truth. That's already a problem. Um,
yeah.
if truth is truly true, then it is singular, right? But but we have two. So we're already off to a bad start. Um, provisional truth is that which happens before my face, right? This table is solid. This, this person that I am is me, right? And then there's absolute truth, which is emptiness and suchness. None of this stuff has any sort of substantial existence. All this stuff is impermanent and blah, blah, blah. We talked about it last episode. And the two truths doctrine challenges you and forces you to accept that these are both true right now at the same time. That, your provisional day-to-day ongoing experience is non-distinct, non-different, from absolute truth. And you have to sort of accept everything that's in front of me that has substance and weight and presence
Mhm.
also doesn't in any way, shape, or form. And I think that that's a key doctrine in Mahayana Buddhism. And I think that that's a really good example of sort of dealing with the contradiction and dealing with the capital M mystery. And I think that that's something important that Buddhism approaches that I don't see other religions approach.
I agree. Is it, I mean, translated, but is it literally called two truths doctrine, or like the two?
Yes, in
Oh,
English, yeah.
okay, interesting. What does the notion of non-dualism have to say about that? What light does it shed on the two truths doctrine?
The non-duality and non-dualism doctrine, it quite literally is like, in my head, I'm thinking, have you ever seen, like a sitcom filming on TV, and they'll show like an applause sign whenever
Mm,
it's time to laugh and clap or whatever.
do the
Um,
left, yeah.
um, non-dualism speaks to the two truths doctrine, and it says contradiction, contradiction, contradiction. And the
Okay.
way I think that it does that is that it shows that um, there's these two ways of looking at the world, and guess what? Both of them are true. Neither of them are true. Both of them are untrue. Neither of them are untrue. And both and neither of them are true and untrue.
The five, yeah. I remember going over that one in one of Mayer's classes, and
The
like
negations, yeah.
yeah, I like having no idea what the hell to think about it.
It
But I guess,
challenges you to sort of understand the in the middle. It points you right at your everyday experience. It points you right at what you see in front of you, right? Because if you see everything as, absolutely empty and impermanent and not there, then that's not useful because it is there. Don't doubt your senses that much, right? But if you view it as being there in a permanent and substantial way, you're going to be disappointed. It's
Mhm.
it's it's bad news for you in the future. whenever something inevitably decays or disappears or no longer looks the way that you think or want it to look. And non-duality looks at those two extremes and shows you the middle way, which is a contradiction between the
Mhm.
two. It's like, yes, everything is empty, but it's there in front of you. Or saying, yes, everything is there in front of you, but it's empty. And showing you like, yeah, your life is in the middle. It's something that transcends those absolutes, you know, the provisional and the absolute. It's something that transcends those two extremes. It's in the middle. And so I think that um, that's a very important way to sort of operationalize or make into action the two truths doctrine is this doctrine of non-duality.
Awesome. Um, that's really very profound, and I agree with you. And I don't think that's like at all like a Buddhist exceptionalist way to look at it. I genuinely think that um to look at it from a purely objective standpoint, let's say from like a religious studies standpoint, that this is something very unique to Buddhism, which I would say is largely influenced um, by philosophical Taoism as well,
Hmm.
and that it contributes to um, this conversation about what is reality, what is the mind. It's very unique in that way, and I think that's one of the reasons that I love it so much. Um, and and I think that Thompson does see that, and I think that what he's saying with his book is like yes to everything that you said, but Buddhist modernists don't give a shit about that, and they don't care
Yes.
about the historical internal debates of like this, but also this, and like that go on for like centuries and across traditions and new schools formed, and you know, um, so yeah, I think that I think that I think that he's aware of that, and that he's saying like more of this, less of the like meditation is like brain hacking or
Yeah.
whatever, you know. Um, but yeah, I forget what I was gonna say. Um, that was a very good analysis. I think I'm just blown away because it's like it for me it comes back to the notion that like whatever we're gonna say or think about consciousness will necessarily have ramifications on our understanding of reality itself,
Hmm.
how we view the universe, our understanding of matter, because they are truly inseparable. Um, so yeah.
So one last thing that I wanted to mention or discuss together before we close is Buddhist modernism and all of its trappings. They are doing something that Evan Thompson isn't really talking about. And I don't think he has to. I'm just mentioning this is something that's also going on.
Mhm.
They are employing and deploying the vocabulary word secular. They are saying, you know, you can be a secular Buddhist. You can do mindfulness practices. You can go to your church. You can do all this stuff and day trip with Buddhism. Um, and we'll give you a watered down, incorrect presentation of it. But you can day trip and you can be Buddhist and atheist. You can be Buddhist and Christian. You can be Buddhist and whatever else. They present their own versions of the Four Noble Truths. And their version of the Four Noble Truths is influenced by science, by cognitive science, by Western philosophy. They present their own version of the Eightfold Path, which is again influenced by this and sort of watered down and whitewashed. And they are sort of basing their assumption on saying, Buddhism is a philosophy. It doesn't have to be or is not a religion. Um, I have my own views about this, which I've done a couple of episodes on Bright on Buddhism, but um, I just wanted to see how you felt about the word and the idea of secular and secularity, and how you think that it relates to Buddhist modernism, and where you see yourself in relation to that.
Damn, dude, I was trying to remain ambiguous this whole time. Um, no, it's fine. The first thing that you thought or that I thought about when you said secular Buddhism is there's this guy I really like. He's a YouTuber called his channel is called Doug's Dharma.
Mhm.
I don't know if have you heard of him?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. He's the first guy that I thought of. And I I I feel like he does the best job that he can with what he's going for. I think while I don't necessarily agree with secular Buddhism, uh, I think it's mistaken. I think it's kind of confused to think in those terms. Um, but in spite of that, I think he does a very good job of saying like, hey, like I know that, Buddhism very much relies on no, the notion of karma, very much relies on the ontology of reincarnation and the cosmology of, Buddha lands and so on and so forth. Um, I don't really believe that, but I'm still going to teach it to you, and it's still going to make its way into um, how I present Buddhism to you guys, even if I don't necessarily believe in karma or believe in reincarnation or whatever. Um, so I guess I would say I think that it's possible, um, but you really have to know your stuff. And more than that, you really have to reflect on like, am I saying this because I want this to fill in some sort of gap in my life that I'm not getting from this thing that I'm nominally saying that I am, namely atheist? Um, or like, am I really contending with these ideas on their own terms? And I would say he does a very good job of that personally. It'd be really cool to get your take in the future. Maybe we could watch a video of his or something. Because I think he's a pretty cool guy. Um, as for me personally, I don't know, man. I think I'm just married to the mystery.
Yeah.
I think that Thompson opened many doors for me that I don't see closing anytime soon. And it's like, I guess to summarize, I would say that I very much agree with and buy into Buddhist doctrine, and now I very much agree with and buy into the opposing views of Buddhist doctrine, namely the Vedic Brahminical traditions that um, Buddhism kind of evolves away from. I don't necessarily believe them to be true um, completely, but um, I know that didn't really answer the question, but that's kind of what it did to my mind, I guess.
No, that's good. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I recommend Doug's Dharma. I don't think that I see him as an agent or a representative of secular Buddhism, um,
Yeah,
as an institution, but I
he's just
do
kind of doing his
see.
own thing.
Do what?
He's just kind of doing his own thing.
Yeah,
And
exactly. But he is a good channel, and as a fellow sort of content creator about Buddhism, I do have to say he's got some good videos to go check out. Um, I think that my issue with secular Buddhism can be broken up into two types of sort of critiques, and they're related to each word in the title. I have critiques about the word secular, and I have critiques about the word Buddhism and how and what they're presenting as Buddhism. Um, Secular Buddhism is this whole like post New Age, post Orientalist sort of it's post all of this like DT Suzuki stuff. It's like 21st century like digestion and whitewashing of Buddhism in a way that's not like new agey self-helpy, but is sort of like a response to that stuff. And it's like,
Hmm.
okay, new agey spirituality, cosmology, nonsense, crystals don't really help us in a real way for the most part. Um, but also like cosmology and X, Y, and Z, these things don't help us in a practical way either. What can we take from Buddhism to live a good life now, here and now? And I don't fault them for having that sort of perspective. But if I had to break it down, the issue I have with secularity in general, let's start there. I, of course, I think that, like, yes, education and government and economy, they should not be involved with religious institutions. But
Hmm.
secularity is an impossibility because we live in a world where religion exists. And if you are responding against that, you are still in a religious world. And true secularity is a snake that eats its own tail. Secularity wouldn't exist if religion didn't exist, and vice versa. So I think that it is an impossibility that cannot really be achieved. And I think it's an oxymoron to say secular and then put a religion after saying secular. Secular Christianity, secular Judaism, secular Islam. It's like, okay, well, if you're secular, those things, what are you doing? You know,
Yeah.
do you, if you're a secular Christian, do you like go to church, but you don't believe in God? Do you go to church, but you don't read the Bible? Do you read the Bible, but you only believe like the history part where they say, and then David begot this guy, and then this guy begot this guy? What are you doing? You
Hmm.
know, and why are you doing it that way? And that brings me to the Buddhism part. Like I said, they have sort of assessed Buddhism and stripped it of cosmology, stripped it of morality, stripped it of consciousness ways of thinking, like mind only doctrine, for example. They've stripped it of complicated, hard to understand doctrines like emptiness that they don't want to spend their time worrying about. And on and on. And they've digested it basically into what has what reads to me actually as a Protestant ethic without a Protestant sort of packaging. The Protestant ethic, what I'm talking about is like, the New Testament, Jesus says, be nice to your neighbors and golden rule and, you
Work
know,
hard.
work very hard and like love your neighbors and don't be covetous and all this stuff. And so they take those words out of that mouth because they're responding to Christianity. They have misgivings with Christianity, and that's what turns them to Buddhism in the first place. That's what turns them secular in the first place. And they take those words and they put them in the Buddha's mouth. And they say, he's just saying golden rule. He's just saying be nice. He's just saying, you know, love your neighbor. He's just saying compassion. He's just saying this. And they've taken out the entire moral framework of Buddhism and the reason it exists. They've taken out this issue of like the reason that you are a good person is so that you can get increasingly good rebirths and then eventually become a Buddha and Bodhisattva, save all sentient beings, reach enlightenment and nirvana.
Hmm.
It's a whole religious thing. Morality is it cannot be secularized in a Buddhist sense, right? It cannot be taken out of the religious morality of of Buddhism. And they're presenting it also in ways that speak to it being religious, but they call Buddhism a philosophy.
Hmm.
They strip it of stuff and then call it a philosophy. It's like you can't do that. How can you strip Christianity of the sacraments and call it a philosophy? Can you strip it of prayer and call it a philosophy? They say, well, Buddhism's just a way of life.
Hmm.
So is every other religion. So is atheism. So is, like
Yeah.
it's not grounded. And it relates to this Buddhist modernism because a lot of the people who are engaging in mindfulness mania and a lot of the people who are consuming Buddhism in this way, they see themselves as secular people or engaging in secular Buddhism so that they can be another religion at the same time. And I don't think that that's I don't think that's very nice. I don't think it's very nice because there's a lot of people who genuinely are Buddhists and who are religious who are
Mhm.
doing this, and there's a lot of bad history of Westerners pillaging East Asian stuff, ideas, concepts, and reformulating them in a way that is digestible and is amenable to our sensibilities. And in turn, you're destroying something that's not yours, right? And
Mhm.
so people who do this, they're consciously or unconsciously, they're taking something that's not theirs and they're breaking it, they're messing with it and saying that it is X or Y. It's like, you know, you're playing with your toy car over here and I'm stealing it and I'm jamming chopsticks into the back of it and I'm saying they're legs and that it's an action figure now. And you just kind of have to be okay with that. You just have to let that happen. And it's also happening across an imbalanced power relationship that is very colonial in nature. And so you have to be
Yeah.
sensitive with that sort of stuff. And this is something that Evan Thompson doesn't talk a lot about, the history of sort of the colonial relationship here. But I think that it's important to remember when you're thinking about Buddhist modernism and when you're thinking about mindfulness mania, because somebody who is probably a yoga teacher somewhere read the Satipatthana Sutta and said, "Oh yeah, I just have to pay attention to my breathing and that's good to go." Wow, Far Eastern religions are so mystical and interesting and blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, you have good critiques of Christianity and of Western religion as an edifice, but that doesn't give you the right to go and destroy something that's not yours. And it doesn't give you the right to sort of commodify it and minimize it to the level of something that you can take a day trip into and out of. You have to take it seriously. You have to treat it sensitively. I mean, they say
Or
it's
at
a,
least really, at least have
yeah,
like your desire to learn or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not saying that everybody who like reads about Buddhism has to become a Buddhist or whatever, but
Right.
I am saying that it's incorrect and unfair to call the fourth largest religion on earth
Mhm.
or the fifth largest religion on earth a philosophy and say that
Yeah.
it's just a way of life and it's something you can do while you're Christian and it's just this and it's just that. It's like, well, Christianity's just a tool of capitalism or some, you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
disrespectful. And if you turn it back, then it kind of shows how disrespectful it is.
Yeah. Um, do you think that I feel like a lot of this Buddhist modernism stuff is kind of this like militant atheist, like reactionary,
Mhm.
like narrative of like, oh, see, like they don't believe in God, so like, haha, I got you, Christians or Muslims or whoever. Um, to me, I feel like it very much has that vibe to it. Um, I don't know. Do you
And
get
a
that?
lot of the scientific data that comes out that tries to support it, it also fuels that because atheists, they have just replaced God with science. They've replaced God with the universe, and they continue to replicate and live Protestant morals, you know, golden rule, be nice, don't covet, don't steal, don't kill, whatever. And so it's like, you know, if you've just replaced God with science and you are seeing scientific studies come out, which are very low quality and which are doing kind of a bad thing where they say, oh, this supports Buddhism, or Buddhism supports this, then you've kind of fallen into a serious trap there, right? Because you're like militant atheist, but here you are believing scientists when they say religious claims are true. It's like,
Without critically analyzing the actual substance of the study or whatever.
exactly, yeah. And also without sort of thinking critically about like, hey, were Buddhists actually making scientific claims? Were they actually attempting to do the same things scientists were doing? No, they were not. They were religious people doing religion. And they continue to be religious people doing religion, and that's okay. And they can be religious. You know,
Yeah.
there's this
No,
whole idea of like
Buddha,
not being allowed to be religious.
I disagree. The Buddha was doing mind experiments and was he was basically like a super like awesome psychologist. No, I'm
Oh
kidding.
yeah.
Um, yeah, but no, I think that's a great analysis. And for all my uh for all of both of our critiques of Thompson. I feel like this is like in general, like I very much appreciate that perspective that he offers. And yeah, I really like this. I really liked this chapter. There's some stuff that I wanted to get to, but we can come back to that another time in the future. I really liked his did you I just very quickly, did you have any thoughts about the three-dimensional phenomenological model that he proposed?
Yeah, yeah, that's well founded and well presented. I think it fits nicely with his um 4E cognition model, and I think that appealing to phenomenology um is a good start and a good component of understanding consciousness and cognition.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah, I liked it too. I have to read more on it. I can't say too much right now. I didn't read it very thoroughly. Um, but yeah. All right. Any last words on chapter 4?
Nope, I enjoyed it, and I look forward to chapter 5 and 6 and the rest of our discussion um of Why I'm Not a Buddhist by Evan Thompson.
Awesome. I look forward to it as well. All right. Well, thank you, Nick. It was a great discussion, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks very much. See you next time.